I'm coming to you from sunny Tucson, Arizona. And this is just kind of a silly slide. One of the things that Tucson is famous for is something called the dinosaur McDonald's. And although there's a little question there about birds versus dinosaurs, but dinosaurs are birds or not birds. Anyway, you can Google for this. And this is our pandemic response. So this is like literally a mile away from my house. So it's just in there for silliness, no other reason whatsoever. So let me get into the presentation part. But before I do that, I want to take just a minute and plug our books. So I joined InterRel back in April of this year. And one of the reasons why I joined InterRel is I had attended a conference several years ago, and I got my first copy of the Look Smarter Than You Are book for PBCS. And I love watching videos. I think they're great, but I really liked having a book. And I have most of these books on my bookshelf at home. And I can say that I have given them to other people. They're awesome. I've given them to people like in their 20s that are thinking about what to do for a career. And I think that's pretty awesome to have a book that can be written by somebody that would kind of inspire you for a career. So I think that's pretty cool. And also, just as a reminder that the pandemic will end and there will be live conferences. This is a photo of the conference where I actually picked up that book. And at that conference, everybody got dressed up as, I don't remember, a character from the 70s or whatever, from a 70s band. So pretty cool stuff. But you're not really here for that. You're here to learn a little bit about the ARC end user experience. So let's jump right into that. And we'll start off talking a little bit about what is a reconciliation. Now, I should mention here, and I'll talk about this at the end, that we have revived our public training schedules. So there is an ARC course coming up a week from today on November the 10th. There will be another one, I believe, in December. So in those courses, we're actually going to do hands-on exercises for all of this. So this is kind of like a little mini course designed for end users. So a reconciliation is a validation that the balance in an account is correct. And I started to say, you know, like maybe it's what you want it to be, but that would really kind of sound bad. So it's a validation that the balance in an account is correct. And different types of accounts are validated or reconciled differently. So for example, for cash, you may want to compare the balance in general ledger to the bank balance. For accounts payable, you may want to compare the general ledger balance to the balance in your AP subledger. I personally come from an e-business suite background. And so there are tools within e-business suite to do this, but ARC's an even better tool. So let's talk really briefly. And if you see me looking to the side occasionally, I do have this printed out in case I forget to say something. So I'm not ignoring you guys. So the balance comparison methods that we have available, and we concentrate in the 3-day class on the first two. So the first one is balance comparison, and that is pretty much what it sounds like. You have a balance from a source system and a balance from a subsystem, and you're comparing the two of them to see if they match within some kind of a tolerance. And when a preparer reconciles an account using that format, in the reconciliation task, you'll see the two balances and you'll see whether or not there's a difference. And if there's not, it auto reconciles. And if you saw Edward Brodsky's presentation yesterday morning, he used the phrase, let the robot do it. And, you know, that's a big thing about ARC is let the robot do it. Make your life a little bit easier. You don't have to tell everybody you're letting the robot do it, but that would make life easier. The second reconciliation method is called account analysis, and you use that for accounts that have no comparative balance. So as an example, preparers would justify the balance in the account by entering manually or loading a list of items such as transactions or adjustments the sum of which would be equivalent to the balance from the other system. The list of transactions is called the explained balance. If there's an unexplained difference, the preparer will use the explained balance and adjustments tabs to either load explained balance transactions from a file or enter them manually, load adjustments from a file, or manually enter them to record adjustments to get the unexplained difference down to 0. Now, in the 3-day course, which again is coming up on November 10th, we concentrate more a little bit on those first 2 reconciliation methods, but we have a third method called variance analysis, which is designed to ensure that balance fluctuations are monitored and explained, but they're looking for variances from one period to another rather than between 2 systems necessarily. So in the 3-day course, we go over this in a lot more detail, and you actually have hands-on experience creating all of these artifacts. But you need to know a little bit about reconciliation building blocks in order to understand why you see what you see as an end user. So there's 3 main building blocks. The first one is your system setup, where you define what an account combination that you reconcile looks like. So in your ERP system, and again, I come from the eBiz background, you might have segments like company or department or natural account, or like in FCC, you have dimensions like entity and natural account. In ARC, we refer to those as profile segments. You set them up during your implementation, and you can decide if each profile segment is going to be a list that you defined in ARC, or it's just going to be something that you enter as text when you create an account profile. Frequencies identify how often do you have to generate a reconciliation task for that account ID. Currency buckets have to do with whether or not you reconcile in your general ledger currency, or whether or not you do some reconciliation in the transaction currency. So maybe you have AP invoices in Canadian dollars rather than US dollars. Holiday rules are specifically designed to keep you from having a reconciliation be late because you didn't work on Thanksgiving, for example. So holiday rules in organizational units are optional, but they're nice to have because they help you deal with the fact that maybe we have different holidays than Canada does, for example. In system setup, we also set up things called process, risk rating, account type. Those are called system attributes. They're primarily used for filtering a list in your work list or in the reconciliation screen. And then we can also create something called custom attributes. If you are loading something like a transaction, where you want for every transaction to store the transaction number and the supplier name. Now, a reconciliation format is something that you define if you have certain questions that people would always answer when reconciling a liability account, for example. So the reconciliation format includes that. It also includes some information about what the reconciliation task is going to look like. So are you going to have different labels in this balance summary area? Are you going to display every row of data, ending balance, adjustments, etc.? So that's part of the reconciliation format. ARC, unlike on-prem ARM, ARC comes with predefined formats to save you some time. You can use those as is, or you can duplicate them and modify the copy. Now, in the 3-day course, we actually create them from scratch, so you understand all the fields, but there are seeded ones that come with ARC. Now, the biggest building block is something called an account profile. And the account profile is what you use to create a period-specific reconciliation task. So your account profile is a combination of profile segments. It includes a reference to the reconciliation format, so you know what the reconciliation method is. But the account profile is where you specify your workflow information. And in this case, by workflow, we mean who's the preparer, who's the reviewer, who's responsible for actually taking action on the reconciliation task. And in ARC, you can have up to 10 levels of reviewers. That's maybe a little overkill, but we do allow you to have up to 10. But you can control whether or not you're going to use 10 in a system setting. Right, so this is a screenshot of an account profile. If you squint really hard, and you can read it a little bit from the slide, in the actual class, you'll get a printed book that will show you screenshots that are a little bit bigger. But in the properties tab, you notice the account ID is 2 segments. Company is X01 and natural account is X1410. The name of the account profile is X01 X1410 inventory. You see the format, which includes the questions that you'll ask. You see the reconciliation method is balance comparison. And when you use balance comparison, you can have the auto reconciliation criteria, which says if the balances match within a percentage, and you can specify that percentage. Now, the other attributes kind of over on the right, the process, the risk rating, the account type, those don't really have a lot of functionality unless you create a rule. And we'll talk a little bit later about how rules can be used to control how your reconciliation tasks get processed. There is an option for you to identify the normal balance of the account. And that means if the account normally has a debit balance, and when you look at it, it's a credit, there will be a warning. Now, on the right-hand side, you see the workflow tab, and that is where the reconciliation administrator identifies who's responsible for the reconciliation task. And the preparer can be a user, or it can be a team of users, right? And the team has the advantage that if one of the users isn't there, that somebody else can act on their behalf. Right, so let's jump into ARC and what it looks like as an end user. If you have worked with other EPM applications, you're probably familiar with the home page. Little tiny bit different maybe in ARC. This particular screenshot uses what we call the Redwood theme. The Redwood theme is real important for things like FCC and PBCS because it allows you to open multiple data forms that show up as tabs in the bottom of the page. That it isn't as relevant for ARC because we don't have data forms. So we have other appearance themes that you can use that are like light blue background, dark blue background, whatever. Over on the left-hand side, you see the Flipboard area, which has the links where you can click on to view an announcement. To view your reconciliation tasks that are late, which ones are due today, due within the next 7 days, and so on. Now, something I'll mention, I think Edward talked yesterday about Task Manager, which is a built-in part of FCC. In on-prem, it was actually a separate product on which I did a presentation in Open World in 2018. But you're going to see some parallels between ARC and Task Manager. Right, there are some similarities. You can actually put an ARC task as a task in Task Manager, which is kind of spiffy as well. So the rest of the homepage includes desktop cards, kind of designed to look like your phone, perhaps. If you click in the upper left-hand corner on the 3 little horizontal lines, which we laughingly refer to internally as the hamburger, you can access the navigator menu, which includes links to most of the same stuff that you see in the cards. Now, if you are not an administrator, you may not see every card in the 3-day class that we're teaching next week. Everybody will be a service administrator, so you would see all of the cards and all of the options in the navigator menu. And realistically, I should mention that your interface with ARC does not have to be primarily through the ARC interface because ARC is going to send you emails. You may like that, you may not, but it will. Another really nice thing about all the EPM applications is the online help feature. Now, if you're in the main screen, the homepage, you're probably just going to see help. But if you're in a specific ARC screen, you're going to see a link for help on this topic. And all of those help screens, they describe each one of the fields in detail. And most of them, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the screen, there will be a link to a little short video about how to do something. And the videos are very, very helpful. So it's good to know that, if you're in the screen and you go, I wonder what that field means, that you can click on help on this topic and it'll give you an answer. So pretty spiffy. Also within ARC, we have the Academy card that's common in all the EPM cloud applications. We have a short library of video tutorials on various aspects of ARC. There is actually an end user video tutorial as well. Not as good as this presentation, of course, but it's out there. So if you were to click on your username in the upper right-hand corner, there's an option to set your preferences. And this is a little bit different than something like FCC or PBCS because there's no need to set your default point of view. But you do have an option for you to upload a photo or a picture of your avatar. You can view what role you have. You can set your status. And most importantly, you can set your time zone. Okay. And the time zone's pretty important because just like Task Manager, reconciliation tasks can show up on a report as being late if you haven't acted upon them right after they open. So your time zone's kind of an important setting. You can also see in your preferences, if you are a member of a team to which reconciliation tasks have been assigned, like maybe you don't want to be on the team, so you can let somebody know that. And the third thing, which is really important, is that you can set your preferences about how often you personally want to receive notifications about reconciliation tasks. So I had a former colleague who was actually a controller for one of the Latin American divisions at Oracle. And they implemented this product at Oracle and he got a lot of emails. So he went back in and he set this and he said, no, I only actually want to get notifications once a day. Now there is a service that runs that sends notifications. And if you really wanted to, you could disable email notifications entirely. That's kind of up to you. All right, so I thought I would include a screenshot of a sample email so that you can see what it looks like. Notice in the upper left-hand corner, you see who it's from. Over on the right-hand side, you see the system setting that identifies the from address. And this is so people know, don't reply to the email because it's not going to go anywhere. And also there's a little note at the bottom that says that this email was automatically generated. So if you got this email, you would click on the little count icon, which says that you have one late notification, and that would take you into your work list. And I want to make a little note here on the screen, a little visual thought note here. I watched Matt Bradley's presentation this morning, and he was talking about the new digital assistant feature. So that's something that you might want to take a look at. And by the way, I do see there's a question. I'm going to save questions for the end, but we will come back to your question, by the way. So the ARC work list screen, which again, you could get to by clicking that link in your email, it displays reconciliation tasks and alerts for which your user is the reconciliation task preparer or a reviewer or an alert owner. And we're going to talk a little bit more about alerts a little bit later. That's a way for you to involve people who actually are not a task preparer, but you need them to do something in order for you to prepare the reconciliation. So this list, as you can see, can be filtered and sorted by multiple attributes, such as the account ID, whether or not the reconciliation task is open, is the reconciliation task associated with your organizational unit? And also notice that the icons are a little bit different. The icons for reconciliation tasks, they display as a little blue square. a notification in your work list for an alert where you might be being asked to do something on someone else's reconciliation task, those display with a little bell icon, right? And they're not actually a task that you have to act on. There's somebody asking you to do something on a task that you're not the preparer for necessarily. Right now, the Actions button in the ARC work list screen allows you to export your work list to Excel, generate a report binder, and we will talk about report binders a little bit later. And it also allows you to import pre-map balances or transactions for reconciliation tasks. Now, one of the things that's really nice in ARC is that most of the screens that display a list allow you to select the columns that you want to display. And most of the list screens have columns for created by, created on, last updated by, and last updated on, which is a really nice feature. And I guess, like, I come from the eBiz background where we had this thing called Help Record History. And so I think it's great that it's part of this product. But one of the cool things about selecting the columns that you want to display is you can determine which columns actually get exported when you do an Excel export. Now, the summary region in the work list screen is a summary of your reconciliation tasks, not necessarily those for everyone. And if you click on any part of the pie chart or you click on any of the links, like the late link, it's going to take you to a filtered list that is filtered by that criteria. Now, I want to talk really briefly about auto reconciliation, since Edward talked about the fact that ARC is something that has a real bang for the buck in terms of implementation. And part of that is the let the robot do it concept. So if the balances for a reconciliation task meet the appropriate criteria to be auto reconciled. So for example, the reconciliation method on the account profile is balance comparison. The auto reconciliation criteria is balance match by percentage. And you load balances and they match within that percentage. Auto reconciliation runs, the reconciliation task status is automatically set to closed and you don't have to do anything. How cool is that? But if you're wondering if a particular reconciliation task did auto reconcile, you can see in the screenshot, there's a column that says auto reconciled, and it will display yes, if that, excuse me, if that particular task was auto reconciled as soon as the data was loaded, and that's kind of spiffy. So, but because this is about the end user experience, we want to kind of spend a little bit more time about reconciliation tasks that do require some end user interaction. So if you were to click on a reconciliation task, initially you're going to have some options. So if you were to squint really hard, you could see that the button that I put a little box around in the upper right-hand corner says release. Now, if a reconciliation task is assigned to a team, hey, and you're a member of that team, right? The button, instead of saying release, it will say claim, because you have to claim the reconciliation task, excuse me, in order to take action on it so that somebody else doesn't grab it first. But if you're the primary user on the team to which the task was assigned, it gets automatically assigned to you, but you can release it if you don't want to act on it. Also, depending on system settings, which I show over on the right-hand side of the screen, you as a reconciliation preparer can reassign the reconciliation task to another user. Now, that's a setup option. So if in your organization, all requests to reassign a reconciliation should go through the admin, you can set that up in system settings. And then if someone wants the reconciliation task to be reassigned to another user, they request reassignment, and then a notification goes to the admin, and they can either assign it to the requested user or they can reassign it to someone else. Now, within the reconciliation task, you'll see the summary region, which displays your balances. And how the way that that looks is determined by the reconciliation method and the design of the reconciliation format that was referenced on the account profile from which you generated the periodic reconciliation task. So this screenshot shows a reconciliation task that uses balance comparison as the reconciliation method, and you see the tabs say summary, adjustments to source system, and adjustments to subsystem. And the columns say source system and subsystem, and then the rows display, display ending balance, difference, adjustments, etc. Right. The titles of the columns are defined by the reconciliation administrator in the format when it's defined. They can also decide whether or not they're going to display all those rows, the ending balance, the difference, the adjustments. Those rows can be hidden in the reconciliation format to control that display. Now, the section at the bottom shows information from prior reconciliation tasks for the same account ID, if one exists. Now, this one shows the display of the summary region for a reconciliation task that used the account analysis reconciliation method. And you'll notice that the tabs are different. You see a summary tab, you see a balance explanations tab, where you would see transactions that you loaded to explain the balance, and you see an adjustments tab where you would have entered adjustments to explain the balance, right? So the tabs that you see are dependent upon the reconciliation method that you chose, which is referenced in the reconciliation format, which is associated with the account profile from which the reconciliation task was generated by your reconciliation administrator. Now, I am going to take a brief moment and talk about ways that balances get loaded. And let me say that we do actually cover these in the 3-day class, and we do actually do all 3 of these. But as an end user, it's entirely possible that this is all automated and you're not actually loading balances. They're just there when you go look at the task. So you can load balances by manually clicking on an icon and actually entering an amount. And you might do that if you have an attachment that you can add that would be supporting documentation of that balance. You can import balances using what's called a pre-mapped balance data file. That would normally be done by your reconciliation administrator, either from the period screen that we haven't talked about yet, or from the reconciliation screen, or by your user from the work list, but it's normally done by a reconciliation administrator or some automated method. The other option is data management, which you may be familiar with from FCC or PBCS. And the advantage of that is that you have options for mapping. So maybe in your ERP system, you have multiple cash accounts, one for every bank. But in ARC, you only want to basically reconcile cash. So in data management, you can map those 3 accounts in your ERP system to the one account that you reconcile in ARC. And all 3 of these methods we do cover with a hands-on workshop in the 3-day ARC class coming up on November 10th. Now, if in a reconciliation task, you click on the link for a balance amount, your options are a little bit different depending upon the way the balance was loaded. Right. My screenshot is showing you a balance that was loaded using data management because I wanted to show you the amount details screen, and I also wanted to show you the options. So drill through to source is an available option if your source system is a source system for which we have an adapter. And that's true for eBusiness Suite, that's true for ERP Cloud. And that would literally let you drill back to the balances screen in the ERP system. And then you have whatever options you have within the ERP system to drill back from there. In the 3-day course, we don't actually have eBusiness Suite or ERP Cloud installed. So we load balances from a file, and you can actually open that document. Now, it's actually not the original source file. What it is it's a copy of the original source file that gets created via the data import. You also have the option when you click on the amount to view the mappings that were used, if in fact you did a mapping like I described earlier. So next, we're going to talk about the different tabs that are available in the reconciliation task. And of course, if you were in a class or you were at your own site and you were in an ARC environment, I know that you would all be clicking on all of these tabs going, oh, I wonder what information's in that tab, which is the advantage of being able to, actually have a system that you can look at, right? But you'll at least have this PowerPoint presentation. So the properties tab, the tabs are all over on the right, okay, vertically. The properties tab displays the account ID, the status of the reconciliation, what period it's for, the start date and the end date as proposed by the admin, and then the actual end date, which gets populated when the reconciliation task is complete, what method was used, what the auto reconciliation criteria were, and then some of those other fields that you see like process and account type and risk rating, which are really just there for you to filter reconciliation tasks in your work list. And then down at the very bottom, you can see the settings from the account profile that indicate whether or not you're actually able to manually enter balances by clicking on a link in the task itself or not. Now, the second tab that you see is the instructions tab. That will display instructions both from the reconciliation format, which is for a grouping of account profiles, and then for a specific profile. And instructions are one of those things. My fellow instructor, Stan Ziolkowski, always says that he thinks that instructions are really underutilized. So you can attach to the instructions, you can actually attach a desktop procedure. Excuse me, you can limit the size of the desktop procedure. But one of the things that the administrator can do in the instructions tab is tell you whether or not, in order to complete the task, there's questions that you have to answer, or there's custom attributes that you need to populate, or in order to complete the task, you have to add a comment, or you have to load an attachment. So all that information can be put in the instructions so that, the reconciliation preparer is not calling the administrator going, I tried to submit it and I get this funny error message. So instructions are pretty important. Now, the reconciliation alerts option, it looks like a little bell, and we saw an alert in the work list. An alert is something that you as a preparer can create to basically ask for help from someone who may not be a preparer or may not be a reviewer. So alerts can be created. If you squinted on the left-hand side, you can see that you can set up an alert so that if the alert isn't resolved, the task can't be closed. But you don't have to set it up that way. You can set it up to prevent closing of the task or proceeding of the task to a reviewer, but you don't have to set it up. All alerts are visible to the reconciliation administrator because there's a separate card. The administrator can delete alerts if no one ever responds to them, but they are part of the reconciliation task history. And that's really nice because what that means is if you asked another user to give you a file that you're using to justify the balances that you're manually entering, that file that they uploaded as an attachment to the alert is a permanent part of the reconciliation task record. So it's all about the history. There's a great audit trail in ARC, which is pretty wonderful. This is a screenshot of what an alert looks like. You notice it looks somewhat similar to a reconciliation task, but actually somewhat different. So Whoever gets this alert, they can enter comments, they can add an attachment, they can see the history, but its status is kept separate from the reconciliation task from which it was created. So unless the alert was created in such a way to prevent closing of the associated task, it doesn't necessarily need to be complete in order for the task to be complete. Now, the workflow tab is where you as the preparer can see if it recognizes that you claim the task. You can see whether or not there are any reviewers. And again, you're allowed to have up to 10 levels, but that's limited by a system setting that I show on the right-hand side. Now, there are instances where your reconciliation is going to have a warning. One of the warnings, like you see in the slide, is that the reconciliation is overdue. There are some other types of warnings that you'll get. They don't necessarily prevent the task from being submitted or closed. So another example of a reconciliation warning would be a normal balance violation. On the account profile, you said, normally I expect this to be a debit, but when someone loaded the data, they mistakenly flipped the sign and now it's a credit. That will show up as a warning, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will prevent you from submitting the task, although we'll talk about rules in a minute. Another example of a warning is that you loaded an explain balance transaction, and in the account profile, you said, I can't explain a balance with the transaction that's more than 30 days old, for example. Now, the attributes tab, we'll talk a little bit more about attributes later. The attributes tab is, do you have certain piece of information that you want to collect from the reconciliation preparer? And this is different than them answering a question, because if you collect information as an attribute, you could use that information in a rule that might control how the reconciliation task gets processed, which is kind of neat. Right, so I don't have any set up in the screenshot, but the tab is there. And then reconciliation questions. Questions are defined by the reconciliation administrator as part of the format. Answers to questions can be required, and that's part of the format definition. You can say an answer to those questions is required by the preparer, or it's required by the reviewer. We have kind of a silly question. Have you followed all the procedures? Who would answer no? But the question types can be text or date. I think there's a long text option. There can be a number. They can be an integer. They can be yes, no. They can be true, false, or you can actually provide a list of values. So in the 3-day class, we actually have a question where the answer is, what kind of transactions did you load? Did you load invoices? Did you load payments? Did you load both? And that's an example of a question that has a list of values. And if the answer is required, it will actually show the user that they have to answer the question in order to submit the task. They'd also get a little pop-up window if they don't answer the question. The attachments tab allows a reconciliation preparer or reviewer to attach either a URL, and in the screenshot, you can see I've got an attachment for the Oracle website. I've also got an attachment that's a balances file that supports the balances that in this case, I manually entered. And notice on the left-hand side of the screen, these balances were manually entered. And you can tell that because there's a little pencil icon. Right, so the attachment size can have an impact on performance. There's actually some later options about using other systems to store attachments, but the attachment size can be limited by system settings, and that's shown in the little screenshot over on the right-hand side where it says maximum attachment size. So if you want to limit how big the attachment's going to be, you can do that via a system setting. Also, and we're going to talk about rules in a minute, you can require that an attachment be loaded in order to process the reconciliation task. Now, the comments tab, pretty self-explanatory. It allows a preparer or a reviewer or someone with what's called the commentator role can add a comment, but they can't submit the task for completion. And again, System settings will determine whether or not that comment can be deleted. If you're one of those people like me that has a sense of humor, you do have to kind of remember that ARC is sort of like Facebook. Once it's up there forever. But maybe you'll look back on it and think it's funny. Who knows? Right. The prior reconciliations tab is a shortcut to take you to a prior reconciliation record for the same account ID for a prior period. Now, if the balances don't match and you need to have an adjustment, you can either create an adjustment manually or you can import it from a file. If you're going to have an adjustment, you might want to have some extra pieces of information about that adjustment, like a journal entry number, for example. So the columns for each adjustment as a minimum include a short description, but you can make that optional, the transaction date, the amount, and then behind the scenes, it's always going to store who created it, when it was created, when it was last updated, who made the last update, and everything is going to be stored as part of the reconciliation task record. So if you generate a report binder, you're going to see that information later. Same thing is true for a balance explanation. This is an example from the 3-day class. And what we loaded as explanatory transactions was AP invoices. And in order for us to consider that complete documentation, we needed for every invoice that we loaded to have the name of the supplier and the transaction ID. The transaction date, it's always going to require that, but the supplier and the transaction ID, those were custom attributes that we added to the reconciliation format to make certain that when we loaded the reconciliation transactions that we had enough detail. The aging violation will display if you had a limitation on the account profile. And I need to talk fast because I'm running out of time. Now, if you use transaction matching, which is day 3 of the 3-day class, you'll have a button for transaction matching. If you click on that button, it will take you into the matching screen. You can manually match transactions based on something called a match type, which identifies what properties of the transaction would actually define what a match is. So do they have to match on the transaction ID and the amount and the transaction type? We also have auto match, which is kind of like auto reconciliation, which is kind of the optimal thing where it just does all the matching for you. And then last tab for the reconciliation is the history. And it's all about the history. So I have a couple other screenshots I'm going to show you where there's different places to view the history. But what you see here is every single thing that happened on that reconciliation task. That includes when it was opened, whether or not the task preparer answered a question, whether or not they entered balances, whether or not they added a comment, whether or not they submitted it, whether or not it got changed to closed, whether or not they reopened it, whether or not they added an attachment. That's all a permanent part of the reconciliation task record. And that is kind of spiffy. Now, I did talk really briefly, I mentioned a couple times about reconciliation rules. So you can have the reconciliation administrator define a rule that would prevent somebody submitting a reconciliation under certain criteria. So in the 3-day class, we actually create a rule that says you can't submit a reconciliation without entering at least one comment. And if they try, they'll get an error message that the reconciliation administrator defines. Completed reconciliations can be reopened, but again, there's a system setting on the right-hand side that will determine whether or not that can be done by the preparer themselves, or that can only be done by the reconciliation administrator. And talking about history, I think this is one of the slickest things about ARC. So for each reconciliation task, you can generate something called a report binder. And the reason why it's called a report binder is it's a report and it's a binder. So the report shows you all the same information that you see in the history tab, but the binder part of it is that it generates a zip file. And the zip file has folders within it that contain every attachment, whether or not it was uploaded on the reconciliation task itself, or it was uploaded to the alert that was created from the reconciliation task. So there is a permanent record of everything, and it's all in one spot, and it's easy to find. So we also, from the history perspective, we have a lot of canned reports, but honestly, you can create custom reports. We don't actually talk about how to do that in the 3-day class, because most of the screens, you can pick the columns that you want and you can export the data to Excel, right? So you can kind of create your own report that way. This is a sample ARC report called the Reconciliation Audit Trail. Reports are defined as queries. You can copy the query, create your own report. And then there are other options for displaying data in more of a summarized format. The reconciliations card, you can select the columns you want to display. You can export that information to Excel. This shows you the file in Excel. I'm jumping forward here a little bit. And we also have a reconciliation overview dashboard, which kind of shows you how you are doing for the current period. It's got a pie chart. It's got a bunch of bar charts. If you click on a section of the pie chart or you click on a section of the bar chart, it's going to take you to a list that corresponds to whatever slice you clicked on. But we also have kind of a performance dashboard called Reconciliation Compliance that lets you see, wow, is everything always being prepared late, or is it always being prepared on time? And we're doing an awesome job. There is another screen called ARC Application Overview. That's kind of an overview that displays activities when you ran the last data load. There is an audit card that displays every change you made to any object. And I mean, not just reconciliation tasks. Anytime you change an account profile, anytime you change a reconciliation format, it's going to store what was changed. There's a column here that shows the old value. There's a column here that shows the new value. And it shows you who did it, when they did it. So it's all about the history. There's history everywhere. And okay, one more card. The ARC jobs card displays a list of all the jobs that have been run, including the email notification job, which will show you, how often is that running in case somebody says what people always say, I never got that email.
So this is a quick screenshot of our upcoming training sessions, and you're going, but wait a minute, we're already in the week of December 6th. So we do have a Planning Cloud Fundamentals class that's going on actually today. And then the FCC course for next week, I think is not going to run, but there are some open trainings coming up in January. So something to be aware of. And I apologize, I'm going to skip over this section. This is information about the actual 3-day course. If you want, I'm going to have my email address at the end and you can email me and I can send this to you. This explains exactly what we cover, what hands-on workshops we do in the 3-day ARC course, right? Which is, I think, a pretty good course. So, but rather than spending time on that, I want to give Pat a little bit of time. So follow-ups for ARC after this webinar. The first one, you might want to take the 3-day course. The 3-day course is literally hands-on, right? You get to break things, you get to fix things, which I don't know. I think for me, that's the best way to learn, is for me to have hands-on. The second bullet point is there is a document called Setup Best Practices, which talks about some implementation strategies, one of which is something called a tracking only implementation, where you're just taking all of the myriad places that you've stored reconciliation information and putting it all into ARC for an initial centralization of information. There are some videos on Argonaut Interrel's YouTube channel, and you can also send me an email, and that's my email address at interrel.com. And now I am going to flip over and I'm going to hand it over to Pat Retker. Pat, are you there?
I am here.
Okay, so I'm going to be quiet now.
Oops, I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
I'm going to be quiet now and let Pat talk a little bit about some considerations from the consulting side. Okay, take it away, Pat.
So let me know when you're finished.
I'm done.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm a consolidations consultant. My primary areas are FCC, ARCS, and data integration. I also have experience with the older products as well, you know, from Hyperion to Oracle. So when we go, you know, when we visit a client to discuss a possible implementation, and actually same questions for requirements as well, we ask typically, what is your current process for account reconciliation? Typically, you're going to find that clients who are looking to move to a reconciliation product are either perform the reconciliations in Excel or Blackline. Another thing is how often are account reconciliations performed? Some clients perform them monthly, some clients perform some monthly, some quarterly. Also, how many accounts do you reconcile? You know, I've had up to like 10,000 accounts. How many people are involved, you know, in the reconciliation process? At what level are accounts reconciled? Do you reconcile by company, department? And that would be covered with the profile segments and the account profiles. What subsystems would you be integrating data from? And again, this can be done with a link in data management rather than getting hard-coded, you know, files or extracts from systems. And that, you know, that can be done through data management as well. How often, oh, I think I already did that. How often you perform account reconciliations? How many preparers are there? How many reviewers are there? And what is the overall approval process? Transaction matching used to be an add-on, but now it comes with the product, just like, you know, with EPM, just like account reconciliation does. And as Andrea mentioned, you're gonna, you know, the typical transaction matching is done against like bank statements. It actually will look at the bank statement and compare it to what you're loading in from the GL and match up those transactions. And if it can't match it up, you can give a threshold. There's a lot of things you can do to, you know, to tie out your, to reconcile your bank transactions. So anyway, does anybody have any questions? Is the mic open? Or will they do it in chat?
It'll be in the chat. I do not see.
Yeah, I'm looking in the chat and I don't see any questions. Andrea? Oh, you're on mute.
So I don't really have anything else, Brianna. I think we're getting close to our 1 o'clock cutoff. Let me flip back for a second in my PowerPoint deck. So
here's a question.
Oh,
can you elaborate on teams and what was the other? And grouping of account IDs.
I can.
Okay.
Pat, do you want to take that?
Yeah. So teams are so people in different departments. You might want to set up teams for each department, and the way that works is that you can, if you're out on vacation, somebody else can claim that. So it's a really good way to handle the entire reconciliation process, just to make sure that somebody on your team is grabbing that reconciliation. So you can claim them, you can unclaim them, you can assign to someone else. there's a lot of things you can do with that. Grouping of account IDs. Are you talking about like sub reconciliations? You know, can you answer that, Andrea? Because I'm not sure what you discussed on the grouping of account IDs. Were you talking about summary?
Yeah, well, that was going to be I'm not certain if that's what the person is asking. There is functionality to do what's called a summary reconciliation, which is basically summarizing multiple individual account profiles into a single reconciliation. So maybe, I don't know, the only thing I can think of off the top of my head is maybe, you know, you have like 5 reconciliations for different cash accounts, but there's a summary reconciliation for cash as a whole. But I'm not certain if that's what they're asking about, or if they're asking, there was a newer feature called sub-segment, and I'm not certain if that is what they're asking about.
There you go, sub-segments. So each of your reconciliations, you have segments to your reconciliation. Let's say that the entity is 100, the account is 10,000. For some accounts, you may want to have a department. You don't have to have all of those segments for each of those account reconciliations. You can have 2 segments for one, you can have 3 for another. And I think that's probably what you're asking.
Douglas, was that kind of what you were looking for? Is that you don't have to have all the segments for every reconciliation. So like if you don't reconcile everything by department, you don't have to have that as a segment for everything.
Yes, the answer is yes. You can't, nobody can see it. Doug is asking, can they be mixed? Some with 2 segments, some with 3. And that's each of these reconciliations is one reconciliation. Okay, so each reconciliation will have the number of segments that are assigned to that. So you're talking about one reconciliation? No, because you would only have one combination for each reconciliation, one combination of segments.
So it's based on the account profile, and the account profile has a specific number of segments. I don't think that we've tried like having a summary reconciliation where some of the children are 2 segments and some are 3. But
I see.
I'm not certain if that's what you're asking, but we haven't tried that. But feel free to email us if you have an example. Are there any other questions? Because I know that we're kind of at the hour. And you do have my email address. And if it's a question for Pat, I can certainly forward it on to her. And Brianna, I think, can probably capture any other question information as well. All right, so Brianna just put a little note for me, or this is in the chat. Any additional questions, you can email info@interrail.com. And next week, there will be another webinar about why upgrade to Oracle EPM 11.2, and that's for our on-prem users. Information about why you want to upgrade to 11.2 from whatever prior version you're on. So if there are no other questions, thank you everybody so much for your patience. And hopefully we will see you in another webinar, or maybe one of these days, hopefully really soon, live in person at a real conference. All right, so thanks. Have a great afternoon.